it, essentially, as some kind of solution. And to me, that's pretty much similar to suggesting that 1 million people in Northern Ireland should be deported, which rabid Republicans did suggest when I was young. I haven't heard that suggested for a while, but when I was young, regular you'd meet drunks in bars suggesting that the 1 million Protestants, Unionists in Northern Ireland should be sent home to Scotland. Now, of course, they've been there 300 years. The settlers, some have been there since before I was born. But it's 51 years. But the point is, if you're in the business of suggesting, this is the line I take with them, right? I don't suggest that everything done with the settlements was always right. I'm kind of agnostic on that, or I'm willing to, I don't really have a position as to whether every settlement created or town, settlement is, as you're right, it's a dodgy word. It's a dehumanizing word. But every town or village or community created was a good idea, or creating any of them. I don't really mind what position people take on that, but the point is, if your solution to a problem is to move 0.6 million people, you need a better solution. It's, come up with something else. That's just not what a reasonable person would suggest. And then, of course, when you dig into it, you discover they'd no idea that many of these are places the Jews were evicted from earlier, like Hebron, famously. So what they're saying is that the Jews should remain evicted from Hebron, or they should be evicted again, and then remain evicted. And,
it's like the 1948, I suppose, when Jordan took the West Bank and Egypt took Gaza. The equivalent argument that Kontorovich uses is that in 19 years' time, would we turn around and say, if Ukraine took Crimea back, that no, that belongs to Russia? Would we say? I mean, that's the argument. It was only 19 years, so it's and then they've established a country. Like, even though the document that created those lines explicitly said these are not borders.
Well, in East Jerusalem, those pictures of all the Jews fleeing the Jordanian sector for their lives, essentially. I would take the view that I kind of don't have strong opinions about where anybody lives in the world, and I think people who do have very strong opinions that this group should not live there are creepy and there's something wrong with them. And that's the line I tend to take with people who are obsessed with the West Bank settlements. So there's 0.6 million people there, so what? Deal with it. Come up with some future where that's fine and work with it. It doesn't really matter how they got there at this point. So I kind of paint them as illiberal because I think they are. And of course, it's only the Jews of the West Bank. They're the only people in the world that these people want to deport. There are no Muslims that they want to deport from anywhere. There's nobody else in the world they want kicked out. It's just these.
I mean, it happened it happened in Cambodia and East Timor as well, and in Western Sahara, and in no other conflict in the world has it ever been suggested in the peace settlement that people have to leave. Never been suggested before.
A great example is all the Germans who were kicked out of the eastern part of Germany, which was then renamed as the western part of Poland. But it was totally German. I mean, it wasn't that the Poles were getting back what was Poland. It wasn't Poland.
Danzig and all that.
There's a huge chunk there of territory, and they were brutally expelled, German civilians, after World War II from that area.
East Prussia.
Yeah, I think,
With India and Pakistan as well.
That's it as well. Now, when it comes to the Germans, people said, but they were Nazis. What do you mean they were Nazis? These were civilians who were kicked out of their homes where they'd been living for hundreds of years. And they were cleansed back into Germany. And then the Germans didn't make a big thing of it because they were trying to denazify, and the people who were complaining about it, obviously Nazis were complaining about it, but it took decades really for Germans to say, no, this was really wrong. It was wrong. The Germans themselves kind of buried it as, well, we deserve it all, we brought it all on our heads. But it was terribly wrong. And I've seen estimates that 1 million Germans died as a result of being expelled from, mainly from what's now called Poland. It wasn't Poland then, but what's now called Poland, and it wasn't
called Pomerania.
Czech Republic.
Pomerania.
Incidental land, yeah.
Probably will. There's a lot of names here. Anyway, yeah, we can look up the map. It's and then all the Greeks who were expelled from Turkey. So Smyrna burnt to the ground. Sorry. Oh yeah, and sorry, and Turks were expelled from Greece as well in 1922. So there's been these terrible ethnic cleansings, and obviously the Jews all across North Africa and the Middle East. There's been these appalling ethnic cleansings and population movements which didn't involve ethnic cleansing, but were maybe unwelcome for some reason, but didn't necessarily cleanse anyone. This is just history. It's the whole world. It just goes on and on. And but to suggest a new one as some solution is just so horrible. And to find liberals suggesting that 0.6 million people should get out, I view that the same as saying 1 million unionists should get out. Go to Scotland.
In agreement. You're absolutely right. Even if there's no ethnic cleansing involved, like as I said, I'm from Turkey. We still have the effects of that population exchange. Although there was no ethnic cleansing involved, like 6 million Greek people were sent to Greece. They have never lived in Greece. And the Greek wasn't ready to accept that population. Turkish people came here. They have never lived in Turkey. It didn't make much sense. They have suffered like numerous problems.
At the risk of arguing, neither of those groups of people wanted to move.
Yeah.
So that's ethnic cleansing. It was ethnic cleansing on both sides.
Yeah, like no one was killed, but yeah.
Who was killed?
No one was killed. There wasn't. How do you say?
Sure about that.
Yeah,
You're right. It was more peaceful than most expulsions, but
some people starved.
I think no one was killed. Might be a bit rosy there.
Some people were
Smyrna was burnt down. And there were lots of people killed. Anyway, we'll get into that later.
That was after the war, the population exchange. Smyrna was burnt down during the war. After that we made peace.
Yes. Well.
And then population exchange happened.
Yeah.
So two different stories.
Population exchange means a couple of million people are kicked out of their homes with the clothes on their back and just get out. And I think a lot of people were killed.
That won't be a happy story for neither of the parties.
It wasn't a happy story. No, it happened on both sides. And but any solution that involves all the Greeks will now, the descendants of the Greeks will now go back into Turkey, and all the descendants of the expelled Turks will now go back into Greece. It's just not realistic, and these are just fantasy solutions. But what just amazes me is how people think that they're moderate, because they only want to deport 0.6 million, not 6 million. That makes them a moderate, you know. It's just amazing what's in their heads. How about deporting nobody? You know, how about that as a plan, you know? Anyway.
I think just to finish up, we'll pitch you with one final question.
Okay.
I think, what are your views on the Palestinian conflict, Israel-Palestine conflict going forward? Are you a proponent of the one-state, two-state, even three-state solution? Or what do you believe are the measures Israel should take to try and further the needle in terms of peace?
That is a good question. I mean, it's very difficult for Israel. Like, they've got multiple threats. They've got Gaza, they've got Hezbollah, they've got Iran, they've got Fatah's low-level stabbing Intifada and car rammings and whatever they're planning next. It's hard to say that they make, you know, if I were to say they made a strategic error, it suggests a certain arrogance, you know. I mean, could one argue that withdrawal from Gaza was a strategic error? Because difficult as it was to maintain the security of 8,000 Jews in Gaza, it really hasn't worked out very well since withdrawing. Not for the Gazans either. It's been bad for them too. But you can't really unscramble those scrambled eggs and put back in. So, should Israel make a determined effort to go in on the ground and overturn Hamas? And is there anything that could replace them there realistically? Israel, like with Gaza, Israel is in this situation of attacks gradually getting more serious, escalating, then Israel pushes back and causes serious damage to Hamas's infrastructure. And then things are quiet for a while. There was that year when 20 people were killed. I don't remember what year that was. Maybe 2016 or something. Anyway, when hardly anyone died. And then it just rolls on again, because the logic for Hamas is that the war must continue. I mean, the last thing they want to do is to run a state or something and be responsible and accountable to their people. That was Arafat's problem as well. He didn't want to do that. That's hence the Intifada in 2000. So the logic is, more provocations. They've got this new idea, attack and defense, and of course they'll bring in any child or amputee or anything that they can find in order to sell their narrative, and then if it gets worse, then eventually there'll be another proper short war, which will only solve things for 2 years. So this has been going on and on, this cycle, for ages, and it's kind of hard to see on the Gaza front what could be done. Then on the Hezbollah side of, or Iran side of things, you could argue. I don't know, but again, I have a lot of respect for decision makers. I was on a academic tour. It was a kind of military academics of Israel, and we did get to speak to some fairly senior IDF officers about their decision making. And it is very difficult because, they're aware of all the positions of all these rockets in southern Lebanon, but, almost all of them have human shields around them. They're inside houses. And, when the war starts, the family might clear off, or maybe not, and they'll get the rockets out and use them. But so preemptively striking them is very difficult. Then, when it comes to Iran, it's a long flight. Why have we not seen a daring raid on Iran of the scale that stopped Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program? Shouldn't we have seen that before? I don't know. I have a lot of respect for the people who have to make these incredibly hard decisions that will lead to serious consequences. I do say, when I talk about the future, that the only real hope is for a kind of change in Palestinian culture, a kind of thawing, like a loss of belief in communism, that equivalent, a loss of belief in jihad and in the glorious struggle that's been going on for 70 years, a loss of belief in the resistance. There's not a huge amount of signs of that happening. If it does happen, and there are genuine dissidents, I think Israel needs to, and all Western countries need to support them. I can imagine Western countries ignoring them, but it's, you don't see the Lech Walesa figures really on the West Bank. Maybe they're afraid, or maybe they're all in exile, basically, and any independent thinkers just leave, and others keep their heads down. But so how do you get those dissidents? Maybe the communist countries are more individualistic than Palestinian society. There genuinely aren't enough dissidents. I don't think there's anything simple. I think Iran is probably my biggest worry if you're talking about Israeli security. What if one day, they get the technology, they smuggle it in, or they deliver it via missile? So, you know, if that day happened, then I think people would say, why didn't the successive Israeli governments take action before, despite the possible consequences? You know, I'm kind of afraid to be so arrogant to suggest what Israel should do, but if there was one thing, it would be taking action against Iran, and to hell with what America says about it. Well, I think America would be okay with it now, but Obama made it very clear he was opposed. But what would he have done? I mean, wasn't Ronald Reagan opposed to the strike on Iraq in the Iraqi nuclear reactor in '81, and said some very mean things? He didn't really do it. He what?
He said boys will be boys.
Did he say? I think he said it privately. Did he, or something?
Yeah,
Didn't I think America condemned him in public though?
it wasn't from the podium, but I
Right.
think, yeah, I think that remark is attributed to him.
Right.
Yeah, but
All right. So
he wasn't too bothered.
he wasn't too bothered, right? But America did condemn them at the UN, I think. So whether, I mean, and some of the, when we were talking, that came up in this seminar with the IDF officers and strategists. And yeah, that's really the thing. That obviously it would be incredibly difficult to mount a serious aerial operation.